Well, good morning. Welcome to today's program of the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. I'm Anil Kashyap. I'm a member of the society, and I'll be moderating today's program. If you're new to us here, here's a little bit about what humanism is. This comes from Lloyd Moraine, who was two-time president of the American Humanist Association. Humanists are content with fixing their attention on this life and this earth. Theirs is a religion without a God, divine revelation, or sacred scriptures. Yet theirs is a faith rich in feeling and understanding. They see sorrows and joys, tragedies and triumphs, touching every fiber of human life. They experience wholesome humility as they venture forward with their fellow men into this as yet unknown. Our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophies, arts, science, and ethics, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming related to economics. And to deliver it, we're lucky to have Peter Ganong, who's going to talk to us about the impact of macroeconomic policies during COVID. Peter is an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He studies a lot of things, but one overarching theme is income volatility and policies to mitigate its consequence. We're going to hear about lots of the different angles that he's used to tackle this during the current crisis, and his work is exceptionally creative and ingenious, and you're going to see why in a second. He received his BA in 2009 and his PhD in 2016, both from Harvard. He worked at the Council of Economic Advisors during the 2009-2010 year, and he helped start the City of Boston's citywide analytics team from 2014 to 2015, and he's also helped start immigrantdoctors.org, which is not for profit. So without further ado, welcome, Peter.
Just make sure that. Anil, thanks so much for inviting me to speak here. This place is familiar in ways that Anil doesn't know. So I grew up in a synagogue in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was called the Worship and Study Minyan. And the hallmark of the Worship and Study Minyan is that in addition to worship, which is usually what happens on Saturday morning in synagogues, they also had study. And so what that meant was basically they reorganized the Saturday morning service a little bit to have a half an hour discussion with a sort of first a frontal speech and then an open discussion about the weekly Torah portion. And there are not that many synagogues that organize their Saturday mornings this way. And so when Anil sent me this email, I was like, oh, this sounds exactly like the synagogue I grew up in, except discussions on a slightly different topic. So it's nice to feel a little bit more at home than perhaps maybe some of your speakers do. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. Having said that, I've actually never done a sort of public lecture like this. Like, I'm very used to presenting to economists and much less used to presenting to a public audience. And so to the extent that you have, I don't know, guidance or questions or, edits to tone, I would welcome those. The first thing I want to do actually before jumping in, and I hope it's okay to break format a tiny bit, is to just ask folks who are here, what do you remember from April 2020? Not in general, there's probably a huge wash of memories in general, but what do you remember specifically about the economic issues that arose and the economic policy response? And it's just useful to get a couple bits and pieces of what stands out to you now before we sort of dive into what happened and what we've learned so far. Please.
I think that was the first time they started with the either bailouts or subsidies and big budget expenditures against COVID.
Yeah.
I think that must have been around the time that they did like an eviction moratorium.
Mm-hmm. Talk about that.
The company I worked for laid off a bunch of people, and the rest stayed behind about 10% pay cut. We worked in the food industry, essential infrastructure. A few months later, they hired most everybody back because they got an EPP loan.
was forced to retire from the Fall University after 34 years with told me that to teach online, and I said, oh no, bye.
So all of these are different bits and pieces of the story that different. Is there one more you want to add? Okay. All these are different bits and pieces of the story that many different households experienced and many different families experienced at the start of COVID. And I don't think I need to talk much about what the overwhelming forces were that led to this. I am going to talk, I retitled the talk a little bit, Anil, just based on what I ended up covering, to be what were the economic stabilization policies that were put in place? What do we know about how they did? What are some of the things we don't know and questions that at least that I still have? There are three other things I want to say before moving into content. So the first is just, obviously this was precipitated by a health crisis. And there were, in addition to the usual reasons to want to do economic stabilization, there were additional reasons because of health, because we wanted people to be able to stay safe and not feel like they had to work and put themselves in an unsafe situation by working. And so even though that's very important, that'll actually be in the background, and I'm not going to talk that much about health stuff today. The second sort of two overarching themes that I want to highlight, because you're going to see them come up again and again as we talk about different pieces of the response, is first, there's a very nice thought experiment, which I learned from one of my teachers, Jonathan Parker, although I think many people said this at the time, which is basically what we wanted to do was be able to push pause on the economy and then unthaw somehow. And part of pushing pause, if this was a video game as opposed to real life, is we want to basically fill all of the holes in income where households and businesses were experiencing them from pushing pause, but without pouring money as much as possible into places where there are not holes. And so then that requires figuring out where the holes are, which is not easy. Even if we weren't dealing with a public health crisis, it would be hard to figure out where the holes are. And then the second thing is that the need to search for holes and try to identify holes as best as we can runs immediately headlong into a problem of state capacity. How well can the state, even if you can ask Anil and he can tell you where all the holes are, that's very different from the state being able to come in and transfer funds to fill those holes. And so state capacity or limited state capacity is really going to be another recurring theme in the story. So I'm going to start by describing federal legislation. So there were 6 parts of federal legislation, major parts, which constitute the economic response to the coronavirus, the COVID-19. The most prominent ones were what's known as the CARES Act, which was passed almost unanimously by Congress on March 27th. There was a follow-up which refilled funds for one of the programs in the CARES Act, which was passed in April. There was a bill which was passed immediately after Christmas of last year, so almost exactly a year ago. And so that was passed after the election had happened, but before President Biden had taken office. And then finally, there's the legislation which the Biden administration has its largest imprint on, which is known as the American Rescue Plan. And these different pieces of legislation all together are projected to pay out about 5.4. There are typos here. Oh, yes. Well, it's not typos, but it's very confusing. Altogether, projected to pay out about $5.4 trillion. And so the response altogether is about 5 times the size of the fiscal response to the Great Recession. So a much, much larger response. The response had a number of components. I'm not sure if you're in the live stream that this slide is legible. Let me just pull out a couple of points. So the first 3 points are about support for small businesses. We'll talk more about that. Payments made to nearly every household. Those were described here as economic stimulus payments. Expansions in unemployment compensation. And those are sort of the 3 largest components and the ones that we're going to talk most about today. There's one other piece we're going to talk about as well. So we're going to talk about direct payments to households. We're going to talk about the expansion of unemployment benefits. I'm going to talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, mortgage and rental interventions, and then I'm gonna conclude with some sort of final thoughts and questions. So I'm gonna start by talking about direct payments to households. So the first round was the CARES Act, and these were payments of $1,200 per adult and $500 per child. The second round, which was the sort of immediate post-Christmas legislation, was $600 per adult and $600 per child. And then finally, the American Rescue Plan was another $1,400 per adult and $1,400 per child. So altogether, we got a little bit under $1 trillion in these direct payments. The direct payments were had an income cap. It's easiest to see their income cap by looking at actually it's survey evidence, which just shows you probabilities. So the cap was a function of household income, where household income is a little bit of different depending on whether the household is a single person without children, a single person with children, or married. And so because of that, you can see that and the thresholds differ depending on those three groups. So you can see basically most low-income households report having received a payment. This is in a survey that's run by the Census Bureau, and very, very few high-income households report receiving a payment. Of course, almost all households are on the left-hand side of this plot, and so almost all households received a payment. The only households, there are basically two types of households that would be income eligible but would not receive a payment. So one type is undocumented workers, who are, if you're not filing a tax return. And then the other is some people don't regularly file tax returns, for example, if they're receiving disability income, which is a relatively small amount or is sometimes untaxed. And so those groups will also not receive it. Finally, there's an issue or a challenge about getting money to people who don't have bank accounts. Sort of independent of filing a tax return to get the credit, we need a way to get the money to you. Most of the money is sent out by direct deposit into people's bank accounts. A little bit is sent by mailing prepaid cards to people. And yeah, I think those are the two main ways that they used to use paper checks, but now they don't. Paper checks are more subject to fraud, and they don't use those as much anymore. So these payments were nearly universal. There were basically two types of arguments, I guess I would say, that were made to do these type of payments. The first is an argument about basically wanting to, seeing that aggregate income was going to fall and wanting to fill some of the gap. Of course, the question arises, why would you send payments to everyone to fill the gap? And I think that there are basically two arguments that were made. One argument was this is politically popular, and then another argument was there were during the crisis, and in general there are cracks in other parts of the safety net, and the idea is that the people would get the checks even if they fell through other parts of gaps in the safety net. So implicitly, that's an argument of we don't have the state capacity to target the money appropriately, and so we're going to do this instead. Now, I want to point out it's very expensive to send a check to everyone because you think there are some gaps in the safety net, and so the financial cost of having holes in the safety net is very large if you think you have to send a check to everyone in order to get checks to people who really need it. So what do people do with the money? This is actually surprisingly difficult to answer, and I spend a bunch of my life trying to answer questions of this form. Why is it not totally straightforward? This is sort of like an economist, non-economist moment. Why is it not straightforward? Why is it challenging to answer the question, what do people do with the money? So economists like to look at people's choices rather than asking people, or at least as a supplement to asking people. The reason why that's challenging is because if you ask people, you can ask people what they did, and I'll show you that in a moment. If everyone gets the checks at the same time, we don't have a good way of knowing what would people have done without the checks. We only get to see history roll once. And so economists will tend to look for natural experiments This is actually what the Nobel Prize this year was awarded for. I don't know how much you followed the economics Nobel Prize, but this year's economics Nobel Prize is specifically for finding naturally occurring experiments to study the effects of policies. And in prior rounds, there have been good natural experiments to study how direct payments like this have been spent. This time, there aren't really good natural experiments, or at least they're much lower in quality than the ones that were available prior times, and so it's made it hard to answer. So I'm going to show some survey evidence on the next slide, but I wish we had choices in natural experiments, and that's something I'm working on but don't have any answers about right at this moment. So I mentioned the 3 different waves of checks. So the Census Bureau ran a survey. Tell us what you use the money for. And in the CARES Act, households said that they mostly spent it. A small share said they used it to pay off debt, and a small share said they saved it. For the next 2 rounds, households said that they, many fewer households said that they mostly spent it. Many more said they used it to pay off debt. Many said that they saved it. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not trying to make a value judgment that the money being spent is good or the money being saved is bad. I'm just trying to describe what we know about what happened. One important thing about paying off debt is paying off debt gives households more slack for when something an additional potential bad thing happens down the road. And so I don't mean to say that one of these is good and one of these is bad, but this is just what we've seen so far about what households say about how they spent it. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the expansion of unemployment benefits. This is where most of my research has been on, and so I'll probably have the most to say about this part. So the goal of the CARES Act was to replace lost income for the typical worker. That's the stated goal of the authors of the legislation. And the way that they figured out how much is the lost income of a typical worker going to be is they said, well, average, I'm rounding here, but then my numbers are correct up to rounding to $100. The typical unemployment benefit in the US is the average unemployment benefit is $400 a week. The average worker in the US who experiences unemployment has a mean income before they become unemployed of $1,000. And so they said, we want to fill that gap, and we're going to pay a weekly supplement to regular unemployment benefits of $600. So that's how they came up with the number of $600. Now, I think there's actually sort of 2 ways, given the target of replacing lost income, there's 2 ways in which limited state capacity really came to the fore here. So the first, there's 2 with the $600 and a third we'll talk about momentarily. So the first is this plot takes workers and organizes them into bins of 10% or deciles. So the highest income workers you can see on the far right, and the lowest income workers you can see on the far left. And usually unemployment benefits replaces about 50% of lost income for the lowest income workers, and then it goes down a little bit. You can see this in the blue bars for the highest income workers. Adding in a $600 supplement increases what economists call the replacement rate, where the replacement rate is the ratio of benefits to earnings. And it's going to increase it most for the lowest income workers and least for the highest income workers because it's a flat dollar amount. So why is it a flat dollar amount? In the 2008 recession, there was legislation that added $25 a week. So I guess let me try to do mental math. That's 24 times smaller than 600 to weekly UI benefits. And so the states all had the computer code written to add $25 a week. And for those of you who are programmers, it's pretty easy to change what we call magic numbers in the existing code. And so they said, just take your old code from the Recovery Act and reuse it. Now, given the stated goals of the legislation, you might have thought that they would have instead modified added a supplement that was different for every single worker. And basically the view in April 2020, what they said is that they didn't have time to program that. And so they had time to program a flat dollar amount. And so they did a flat dollar amount instead. By the time it came time to renew the CARES Act in July, the state UI administrators basically said, yes, we can do this in a month or 2 months. But at that point, the $600 supplement actually lapsed completely rather than getting extended. And when they renewed it in January of 2021, they renewed it at $300, and they again just stuck with the flat amount. I'll come back to this a little bit at the end again. Anil, I just want to check. We started at 10:35, and okay. I'll continue to keep an eye on time. So I'll try not to worry about it. But so one point I made is, why are they doing a flat supplement? Second question is, well, how do we end up that 8 in 10 workers are getting more than their prior earnings if the whole idea of the program was to replace lost earnings for the typical worker? And so this basically has to do with a statistical mistake that was made by the drafters. So of the original legislation. So you might remember learning about the difference between the mean and the median in your middle school statistics class. So the median earnings is well below the mean in the US, and that's sort of a feature of every earnings distribution, especially the US, where earnings are pretty unequal. And in addition, workers who are lower income are more likely to become unemployed than workers at the average income. And this is a feature of the economy in general. It's also more pronounced in recessions, and it was even more pronounced during COVID. And so basically, if you don't take into account the fact that workers at the bottom are going to be particularly exposed to unemployment, and you don't keep track of mean versus median, you end up with a $600 supplement, whereas sort of a $300 supplement is probably about the amount that would have is the amount that would have achieved a median replacement rate of 100%. So the policy that was passed at first was very, very progressive. And you can see that here in terms of who benefited the most from it. And the policy had some effects on both household spending and also on households' job finding. And so I'm going to show 2 slides to talk a little bit more about what are those effects. And this is most of what I've spent my time on over the last year, is these 2 slides. So in the left panel, what you can see is households that receive 2 groups of households. The first group of households becomes unemployed in April 2020 and stays unemployed through February 2021 and is getting unemployment benefits through this whole period. In the purple dots, you can see households that are of similar income before the pandemic, but do not become unemployed during the pandemic. And so income for these households is a roller coaster for precisely the reasons of policy that I mentioned before. So I guess, I don't know if I have a laser pointer. Okay. At least for folks who are here. So income is jumping up a lot at the start of the pandemic for unemployed households, because the $600 supplement brought them above their pre-pandemic income. The $600 supplement expires and income drops down to be below, which sort of the normal experience of unemployment is that benefits don't replace most lost earnings. There's one bump up because they paid out some funds in 1 month by an executive order, but otherwise it's consistently down. And then the $300 supplement becomes available and income returns to the same level as for employed households. This is the income side. This is the roller coaster. So spending follows a similar pattern, although to a more muted extent. So what this plot shows you is that spending of households that were unemployed was 20 to 25% higher than spending of those same households before the pandemic in January. And it's also higher than the spending of employed households during the pandemic. So this may be the only time, definitely the only time so far, and maybe the only time ever in US that we will see in US history, that unemployed households actually had higher spending than employed households. And this sort of odd pattern arose because of this statistical mistake that I described. Now, I don't think that this mistake was a big deal in the sense that they were moving fast and you'd rather overshoot than undershoot. But you can very much clearly see that the effects of this mistake in spending here. I also want to mention that totally separate from job finding, and we'll talk about that in one more moment, there's also a set of equity issues and fairness issues that come to the fore when you have issues of limited state capacity like this. So if you think about let me use specifically janitors as an example. So in April 2020, my wife was working at the Northwestern Hospital, And the janitors at Northwestern Hospital are not paid very much. They kept working, and so their incomes would be at this 100% line. But a school janitor who got temporarily laid off would get benefits that were substantially higher than the janitor who was still showing up at work and facing health risks from going out to work. And so there were a set of fairness issues. It's not just simply correct to say, oh, this policy was progressive. It was progressive in a way that I think raised a bunch of important fairness issues that potentially undermined some of the support for the policy relative to what another policy might have been. So, okay, so we went through the roller coaster, and you see the roller coaster for spending as well. Now I want to talk a little bit about how do these benefits affect the labor market. And before I talk about how they affect the labor market, I want to talk a little bit about what people thought would happen. And so when benefits are higher than earnings, if people only care about their earnings in this specific week when they're deciding whether or not to show up for work or whether or not to take a job, in the standard economics model, no one will take a job. Why would you take a job? The argument goes, why would you take a job if your benefits are higher than what you would get while working? Working's not fun. I'm not making an argument that this view is correct or incorrect. I think many people get a lot of benefits from working, which are not the monetary benefits. And so I'm trying to describe a standard view without fully laying out what I think about it. But there were very big concerns. Will anyone take a job again if they can get more in benefits? And relatedly, many workers, so you mentioned that many workers at your firm were temporarily laid off and then ultimately recalled. Would workers show up when they were being recalled if they could get more in benefits than they would get once they went back to work? You'd essentially have to take a pay cut to go back to work, just like the school janitor in my example before would have to take a pay cut to go back to work. So the disaster scenarios that were projected about the immediate labor market effects of this policy completely did not pan out. And I'll describe that in two ways. I'll show it first, and I'll describe it in another outside the plot. So this shows you the fraction of workers every week who are receiving benefits who get a new job, and about 5% of workers who are receiving unemployment benefits get a new job before the pandemic starts. When the pandemic hits, the job finding rate tanks, and it goes down to a little bit over 1% per week when the $600 supplement is available. Then when the $600 supplement ends, you already know that income dropped and spending dropped pretty markedly. The job finding rate did jump up exactly when the supplement ended, but it's not like it jumped up all the way back to the job finding rate up here. It jumped up a small amount on the order of 1 percentage point per week. So the way we interpret this is the labor market, when there are no supplements during the second half of 2020, looks very, very different than the labor market before the pandemic hits. And in my sort of other research, which I'm not going to go into here, we've identified some natural experiments to look at the effects of these supplements. And the sort of natural experiment approach gives very similar numbers to just casual inspection of this plot over time, that the supplements were a disincentive to people finding new jobs. And if you took the view that the supplements had no effect, that view is cleanly rejected by the data. But the magnitude of the disincentive is really quite small. It's not like the labor market would have snapped back to the way it looked pre-pandemic if we had not had these supplements. And one way to index this is to ask, how big is the disincentive compared to disincentive estimates, of which economists have many pre-pandemic? And so the disincentive estimates from this time period are about 1/5 as large as the normal size estimates. So there is a disincentive, but it's much, much smaller than usual. There are two more points I want to make about unemployment benefits in the labor market. So the first has to do with, I mentioned before, recalls. So I don't have the plot today, but I'll just describe the idea. many workers were recalled, and many workers were recalled while the $600 were still being paid out. And those workers, as best as we can tell, all went back to their jobs. Meaning, what I mean by that is to say, there isn't strong evidence that the $600 delayed more than, say, 2% of workers from going back to their jobs if they previously had a job and were recalled. And further, of the people who became unemployed and got benefits during this time period, more than half went back to their old jobs before the $600 had even expired. So they not just were waiting for the $600 to expire, but literally turned down extra checks to go back to work at the time they were asked to. And so that's another sense in which it seems like there's a limited disincentive. There's until now we've been talking for a long time, or I've been talking for a long time about the $600. There's also another component of the pandemic relief, which was new and very important, which is there are many workers who experienced labor market displacement, but were not eligible for the regular unemployment insurance, which we've been talking about to date. And this arises from basically two different types of problems. So one is there are many workers who are self-employed, and workers who are gig workers count under that, although actually are not a particularly large share of that group. You shouldn't think, people always talk about it as gig workers, but think of that as the tip of the iceberg rather than the dominant feature. So workers who are self-employed lost a lot of income. And then also workers who were at the margins of the labor market. So they worked but didn't have enough hours to qualify for regular UI benefits. And so both of those groups of workers, the regular state UI funds won't pay them. But we set up a temporary federal program where more or less you had to upload some documentary evidence of prior income and attest that you had lost this income because of the pandemic. So with very low documentation requirements. And something that I don't have here today and we're sort of still working on is you can see the workers who sign up for this sort of alternative program have substantial drops in income and generally seem to leave the program, that supplemental program, at a similar rate to the rate at which people leave this program. And so if your claim is if you wanted to claim there's no moral hazard from setting up a supplemental program or no discouragement effect, that appears not to be true. But basically, much like the workers being recalled, relying on people to be honest in an emergency about their own labor market displacement and when they need the program, generally seems to have worked out pretty well, and again, much better than some of the sort of more negative projections of what people might have expected. Or if you go to an economics department and ask people, what do you think will happen? They'd say, oh, this, you're letting people just sign up, raise their hand and sign up for unemployment insurance. That'll never work. It seems to have worked decently well as best as we can tell so far, but we're still learning more about it. So that's a lot about unemployment benefits. And that's sort of the longest piece of the four, just because it's the one that I know the most about. There was another piece of the pandemic response, which is known in the US as the Paycheck Protection Program. And this was done on a much, much more widespread basis in Europe and done much less in the US. So Europe has a bunch of history of and infrastructure for paying. When firms cut workers' hours, the firm picks up some of the lost paycheck to the worker. And the goal in the US was to do the same thing, but we didn't have the pre-existing relationships with employers. So remember, the UI system is all about a relationship with the worker. The Paycheck Protection Program, the idea was to build relationships on the fly with small businesses and say to those small businesses, as long as you keep 80% of your pre-pandemic payroll, we'll help cover your payroll. Now, going back to this question about what did people do with their stimulus checks, even harder than finding out what someone did with their stimulus check is forcing a business to spend its money in a certain way. And so we would give grants proportional to payroll, but how would we know that you would have cut your payroll if you didn't get the program or not? So let me restate that for clarity. The businesses could apply and say, I need this money for payroll. And it sounds like you mentioned your business did apply for a PPP loan, or the business you work at. But how do we know what the business would have done if they hadn't gotten the PPP loan? It's even harder than learning as a researcher about what would have happened is trying to specifically find the people who find the businesses that would have cut their payroll otherwise. And so the first round of PPP funds that was in the CARES Act was very oversubscribed, which, just to be clear, doesn't mean the money was well spent or poorly spent. It just means they got a lot of applications. And then I mentioned before briefly, they put out this second round. They basically re-upped the fund and under the second PPP Act, and you can see that a lot more money got out the door in this red line subsequently. And so there's one paper which looks at the effects of delays in PPP. This is from some researchers at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. And we've already talked about how the unemployment rate spiked and the fraction of people not employed also spiked. And so the paper finds basically that places with more delay in PPP loans did have an increase in unemployment. This plot is not well suited at all, unfortunately, to interpreting magnitudes. And so I'm just going to have to ask you to sort of trust me that from a number of different data sources, from public data sources, from companies that are payroll vendors, we basically match, not we, but the economics profession has asked what happened to people who got businesses that got loans earlier versus later, businesses that didn't get loans versus got loans. And the employment effects of the sort of paycheck protection appear to have been really small. And what I mean by that is that we didn't have the infrastructure to find who was going to lay off workers. And so we gave out a lot of money to small businesses and small business owners, but it doesn't look like they retained workers at only a very slightly higher rate than they would have otherwise. And so it doesn't seem like most of this money seems to have gone to business owners and not to preserving jobs that otherwise would have disappeared. The fourth and final component I want to talk about a little bit is mortgage interventions and also rental interventions. And so I'm going to do this with reference to the specifically to what happened in the Great Recession. So you might remember the Great Recession was specifically precipitated by a housing crisis and a foreclosure crisis. And the government set up programs to try to help distressed borrowers. And the way that the programs worked to set up distressed borrowers was they basically, if you were a distressed borrower, you would upload a lot of documentation indicating your financial distress and documenting hardship. And then they would redesign a loan, which would, for at least 20 years, be equal to 30% of your monthly payment would be 30% of your income. And so what this meant was, and this is, I'm going to show you year by year in the blue series. Here's what happened to a typical borrower who applied for help from the government or from their mortgage servicer during the Great Recession. So we lowered payments for a long time. And then some of that lowering was paid for by government subsidies, and some of it was paid back down the road by basically higher borrower payments, in this case, in year 23 and afterward. The CARES Act looked very different in terms of what it prescribed for borrowers relative to what we did in the Great Recession. And basically, the CARES Act said, I talked before about this metaphor of trying to push pause on a video player. So the CARES Act said, we're going to let you push pause on your mortgage, and you will not have to pay your mortgage if you sign up for this specific pause button. And you might wonder, well, what happens to the loan? What happens to the money then? And so the idea is basically we're going to push pause and let you repay those funds at the end of your mortgage in 23 years from now. So the length of the negative bar in the first year for the CARES Act is going to be identical to the increase in the positive bar in year 23. And so it was letting you push pause and delay your mortgage payments. And this policy looked very different because it had a much larger reduction in immediate mortgage payments than the Great Recession response. And it also cost a lot less. So from this perspective of an investor who's deciding, should I give this opportunity to a borrower, or somewhat relatedly, how much would I need to be reimbursed to give this opportunity to a borrower? It's very cheap to kick 1 year's payment down the road. It's much, much more expensive to kick 23 years of payments down the road. And so what that meant was the CARES policy was much cheaper to give. And so that made lenders that was one of the forces that made lenders much more willing to give it out. So we had almost much like the system I described before for the alternative pandemic unemployment assistance. We basically let any borrower raise their hand. Actually, this was even lower than that. Pandemic unemployment assistance, excuse me, you had to document some displacement of income. But here, we just let borrowers raise their hand and say, I'm interested in delaying this year's payment, essentially by 23 years. And many borrowers took that opportunity, although as a share of the mortgage market as a whole, most borrowers did not take that opportunity. So there's sort of similar contracts that are available during normal times, not quite the same. And so about 5% of borrowers raised their hand and said, yes, I would like to delay payments in this way. You might wonder, given that the unemployment rate was so high, why wasn't it more than 5% of borrowers? And the answer is basically we had such a strong safety net response on other dimensions that the need for mortgage specific or rental specific interventions was much more limited. Now, that doesn't mean when you were starting out that if you didn't know which pieces of the belt and suspenders were going to work, you probably want to have belt and suspenders when you're starting out. And so it's not obviously bad, again, to overshoot relative to undershooting. But basically, one in 20 borrowers raise their hand and says, yes, I would like to delay payments in this way. And banks are very willing to accommodate because it doesn't cost them very much to delay a payment in this way. So the effects, if you will, of delaying payment, of allowing borrowers to delay payments were truly remarkable in terms of what happened to the mortgage market. So this is a graph of the unemployment rate and the fraction of borrowers that are behind on their mortgage. And you can see that they both rose in tandem in the Great Recession, and then they gradually worked their way down afterward. And there's a small technical detail that makes this plot a little bit confusing, which is that borrowers who are sign up for this program and are in forbearance do not count towards the delinquency rate. And if I were making the series, I would have harmonized the two, and these authors didn't. But even with forbearance, the jump up in the share of people who are not making mortgage payments or are behind on their mortgage is much, much smaller in the pandemic than it was on the relative to the unemployment rate. We did a lot better. We had many fewer people fall behind, and we were able to get most of them assistance. I want to briefly talk about, so this is about mortgages. I want to very briefly talk about the rental market for one slide, and then I'll wrap up. So there were two parts to the rental market attempt to provide relief to people who are renters. About a third of US households are renters. And because low-income households are more likely to rent, low-income households are also more likely to be affected by this. So affected by unemployment during COVID. So you mentioned before there was an eviction moratorium. And then the other thing is there was a pot of money that was given to states and municipalities to give to landlords for people who fell behind, for renters who fell behind. The moratoria were enforced. And so there appear to have been many fewer evictions during the crisis than there might have been otherwise for non-payment of rent, although it's hard to keep track. The most remarkable thing to me about this, and I'm sorry I don't have the graph, but I can just describe the idea, is that if you look at in May 2020, what fraction of renters are behind on their rent? The best way we have to look at this is basically from large landlords who run large buildings. And so large multifamily buildings, those landlords reported that they actually had fewer borrowers who were behind on rent in May 2020 than in March 2020. So we pushed so much money out the door that more people were able to catch up on their rent than fell behind on their rent. And this is important because A, it's indicative of a sort of a forceful overall safety net response, but also the fear of doing a moratorium is that, well, if no one's going to get evicted, is anyone going to pay their rent anymore? Maybe everyone would have stopped paying their rent with a moratorium on eviction. That didn't happen at all. The share of people paying their rent in the aggregate actually went up. And so I think, with those two pieces of information, it seems like the moratorium was highly successful. Not so for the second piece, the funding. So there's been a lot of press attention to this lately. States and municipalities have had a lot of trouble dispersing funds. The rules had eligibility narrowly defined, and it's hard for government institutions to set up and run a new program with a bunch of documentation during a crisis. We saw the same thing happen last time, actually, for mortgages in the Great Recession. It's really hard for the government to set up and run a new program. It's also hard for other institutions like mortgage servicers to set up and run a new program. This is just never something that seems to work well. This means that we're stuck with, for the most part, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, I think, is an exception. We're stuck with whatever the rails are that we have when the crisis starts. That's what we're stuck with during the crisis, because new stuff isn't going to work well. At least new stuff that's not extremely simple. And that's important because it limits what we can do. Okay, so those are the 4 parts of the response I want to talk about. I ended up with less on measures of economic well-being than I was hoping to have, but I wanted to share one chart which actually was on this chart was on the cover of the New York Times on Wednesday, if you get the paper copy, and it was on the top of the homepage on the website on Tuesday. And it's not a chart I made, but it's by some of my co-authors who work at JP Morgan Chase. And you can see this is not for unemployed households. This is for everyone. The roller coaster of economic experiences expressed specifically in terms of savings. So this is the change in savings relative to pre-pandemic levels. Savings shoot up when the first stimulus check goes out, and it shoots up the most for the lowest income households. That's because the checks are a flat amount, and so they replace the largest share of income or the largest increase in balances for the lowest income households. Balances then work their way back down, then they shoot up again when the second set of checks go out, and then they shoot up again when the third set of checks go out. And they haven't come back down at all to where they were before the pandemic. So savings remain really high, and this is a sort of ongoing source of controversy. By controversy, I mean some people think it's great and some people think it's terrible, but it's one of the ways in which pandemic relief is with us. I should be clear that this isn't entirely about pandemic relief. One way for household savings to go up is for their income to stay the same and for their spending to go down. And many people cut their spending a lot during the pandemic. And so this plot is showing you a mix of the effects of the extra things we did for income with the reductions in spending that occurred. So I think I've been, for the most part, relatively rosy about the pandemic response in terms of having reached a lot of people with a lot of resources. And I want to be clear that the pandemic response didn't reach everyone. So it didn't reach undocumented workers basically at all. It didn't reach some people who don't regularly pay taxes. And there's also some evidence that programs like UI are harder to navigate for workers who have less education. And so we don't think that every single worker who became unemployed and was eligible for UI actually got UI. We do think that the vast majority did, maybe 85 to 90% based on survey evidence. So I don't mean at all to be portraying the response as perfect, even though I do think it was overwhelmingly successful. There are a number of questions going forward, which maybe you'll want to talk about a little bit. So one question is known as missing workers. So there are fewer people working in the US now than there were before the pandemic, even though the economy seems to be running hot on a number of different measures. And so that's an open question, is why is that? And what role did COVID relief play in that? There's also, we're at the highest inflation we've seen in my lifetime, and in some of your lifetimes, I imagine, as well. And one question is how much of, if any of this is explained by safety net policies? And then another question, which, I don't know, we should probably have Anil talk about more rather than me, is why was the Fed's inflation forecast so far off? I don't know, but I'm curious. And then this is my last slide, and this is the most speculative slide, and this is the place where I'm going to editorialize the most relative, I think, has been basically positive description of what happened so far. So COVID relief was effective in the sense that it prevented the economy from tanking further. COVID relief was politically quite popular. Generally, it's been popular with, the pieces were generally popular with voters. And one thing that happened that I think could stick around is I think a number of businesses who were initially really angry about the generous unemployment benefits, for example, realized that basically not having demand, keeping everyone's spending afloat also helped businesses from having declines in revenue. And so I think one thing that was sort of interesting to me to see over the course of the pandemic is businesses that were originally very negative about, for example, about the general relief policies became less negative over time, because what they expected to happen with a recession was that things would fall through the floor. And for businesses that weren't directly impacted by COVID risk, meaning you can't run your restaurant, is obviously a very direct health impact, things didn't fall through the floor and businesses were pleasantly surprised. And I think the financial sector was pleasantly surprised. And I think ultimately became less negative on relief policies than they were before. Most COVID relief, having said effective and popular, last thing I would say is most COVID relief was poorly targeted. And a recurring theme, I think, through this talk has been there was really limited state capacity on a number of dimensions. And this state capacity made the response much more expensive than it otherwise would have been. Why is it a problem? So first, it costs a lot more if you have to send a check to everyone if you don't know who is going to be affected. Second, those checks to folks who didn't need them can potentially have negative knock-on effects. So if you think that high inflation now is driven by the COVID safety net response, you should be really, really angry about, actually, let me pause this for a second. There's a fairness issue with not being able to target money. We already talked about that. And then if you think that high inflation now is because of the COVID safety net response, you should be very angry about limited state capacity to administer targeted payments, because it's the inability to administer targeted payments that is one of the reasons why, if you think this is what's causing inflation now, this is one of the sources. And so you might think, oh, well, obviously we're just going to fix all our pipes. I don't see it happening at all. There's no political constituency that I've seen in the US for building state capacity. I mean, I think you can get economists excited about it, and I think you can get some technocrats, both Democrats and Republicans, excited about it. But in general, the political appetite for fixing leaky pipes seems to be very modest in the US. To give you just one very concrete example of this, the original draft of the Build Back Better Act, which sort of the marquee legislation from the Biden administration, had a bunch of UI reform provisions, and almost all of them did not make it into the final legislation because there was a budget constraint and there was jostling for priorities, and this wasn't a priority. And so I sort of think that the next time a crisis comes, we probably will have a more robust response than we did in 2008. I don't know if it'll be quite as robust as we saw for a pandemic. So I think it'll again be effective. I think it again will be popular, and I think the pipes will probably still be broken. I think that's what I got.
All right. Thanks very much. We're now going to take a short break. You can collect your thoughts, and we'll have ample time for questions. We're going to collect contributions, and the contributions can be made if you're watching online at the address that you see on the YouTube channel, or you can scan the QR codes that are here in the auditorium, or you can leave a donation in the basket at the back. Through our generosity, we show how meaningful the Sunday morning programs are. We suggest a donation of $5, but that's not a ceiling or a floor. You can see that the country's going broke. We don't want the society to go broke, so please give as much as you can. And we're grateful for all of those who sustain the society with their donations of time and money. So please collect your thoughts, and we'll be back in a minute for questions.
You mentioned that there in the past have been some good natural economics experiments, and even the Nobel Prize was awarded for that type of work, but that more recently they have either been less frequent or of lower quality. And I was just curious about why that is, and if it's related to people not behaving normally during COVID, at least with respect to what you're working on. Were there not pockets of people in the US, maybe in certain states or something, that were behaving still a little bit more normally in terms of their activity? So I was just very interested in that. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how that relates to your ability to kind of parse the data here?
Sure. I just was speaking a little, I don't know, too quickly or sloppily. So I'll restate more precisely, and maybe this will change your question, or maybe it'll answer your question. So in 2001 and 2008, they passed relief checks as a matter of legislation, and they were constrained by basically how many printers they had in Washington, D.C. to print paper checks. I'm not simplifying. That was literally the constraint. And so what they did is they said, well, Carolyn's social security number is 99. Peter's social security number is 00. We're going to first do all the payments to people whose social security checks whose social security numbers have a last digit of such and such. And then we're going to move on to people with a different social security number of such and such. And so not everyone got the checks at once. And so that's a natural experiment, because you can compare people who happen to be born with a social security number ending in 9 and get the check first, versus people who happen to be ending a social security number ending in 0 and get the check later. That was a very clever use of natural experiments to study the effects of relief checks. They basically, I mentioned before, they do a lot less by paper and a lot more by electronic deposit. And electronic deposit, you're not constrained by the printer. And so that was the main technological change that for this thing made it harder to study. So the checks that were legislated in December and the checks that were legislated in March went out basically to everyone within a matter of 2 weeks. And the checks that were legislated at the end of March 2020, the original CARES Act checks, went out over a matter of 5 weeks. And it wasn't the last digit of people's social security number that governed when they would get it. And so we can compare people and we're going to put out a study that compares people who got it earlier versus later, but they're not the same. And so that's the sense in which it's a lower quality natural experiment.
Yeah.
More generally, I think the opportunities for natural experiments continue to abound. And given all the limited state capacity and also sort of the roller coaster of legislation, I'm not at all worried about economists' ability to find natural experiments to study stuff. There is lots of interesting and non-standard behavior, which is sort of the other piece of your question, but I don't intend to link that to the natural experiment part, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Good morning, thanks for the talk. So question, as you said,
Can you tell me your name?
Rick Guthman.
Great.
I am a member here at EHS, and you have a pretty rosy outlook on how this has gone. I guess that was the word you used, that maybe there was a little overshoot, but it was pretty darn good. The downside was pretty minimal. And by macroeconomic standards, things have gone pretty well for the last 2 years. But we're now facing a lot of inflation. So would you accept that the overshoot, we're seeing it now, and the delayed effect is just, as you were sort of raising the question, why has the Fed's prediction of inflation been wrong? Or is that the same issue, that your rosy assessment is too rosy, and that we're about to see the misfiring of the programs, the overshoot of the programs?
Nice question. We will see. I think that your question draws a straight line from the safety net response to at least risks of higher inflation now. If you think this is sort of the arrow, I would want to complicate the arrow in 2 different ways. So the first is that there are lots of countries that had a less robust safety net response in terms of total spending than the US did, and are still having a ton of inflation now. So, the fact that the ports have huge supply chain backlogs is not obviously to me an effect of the safety net. One thing that was, I think you could potentially attribute to this. So let me give an example. Let me give a specific example of something which I think is explains why this is complicated, why this is hard to disentangle. So if you think about dividing the economy into demand for goods and demand for services, demand for COVID risk is still there with us. Demand for services is below its pre-pandemic levels. Demand for goods for a long time, for the last year, but continuing, is well above pre-pandemic levels. And if everything was set up before for just-in-time production to produce just enough with a specific forecast about demand, and now we don't have, basically we didn't have a world economy that was set up to handle more demand for semiconductors. So why is demand for semiconductors higher? Do you think it's because people are consuming more goods and less services? Do you think it's because of the safety net response? That's the type of question about which you should introspect to try to think about what's the connection between what we're experiencing now and the safety net, which is basically, if we don't have enough semiconductors, prices for a lot of stuff is going to shoot through the roof. If people didn't have any money to buy anything, then demand for goods wouldn't have gone up. But the main force driving increased demand for goods is that services are risky. That's like my sort of simple mental model. The other thing is that, and here I really blended together different timing pieces of the response, which I think maybe was a little bit, definitely was oversimplifying and maybe a little bit too glib, which is most of the results and policies that I talked about were policies that were implemented in 2020, and I think were quite effective in 2020 with limited 2021 exhaust. The Biden administration, basically their first thing was a large relief plan, and it was hard to know at that time whether or not what the relief was that was needed, but there were definitely a number of people who were saying that the relief at that point in time was too large. And it is very clear, let me just give like one specific example. My understanding is that many states and localities now have financial surpluses because we transfer them a lot more money than they actually needed to fill the holes that they had. And so I guess I would draw sort of a dotted line around January 2021, where I would think that there was a decision, do we push even harder? And I would try to separate that from the stuff until January 2021. Is that helpful for explaining some of the ways I think it's like not a straight line, but maybe a dotted line with a bunch of squiggles between these two?
No, absolutely appreciate the answer. I guess the question, what I was thinking is, well, if we had you back next year, might you change your mind? Are you concerned about that? It sounds like not really. You don't think it's connected, and the inflation rate sits at whatever it is right now all year long. Instability will ensue, and then we'll all look back and say we pushed too hard. I appreciate your answer. I think you're saying it's not that connected. We did a good job. We were off by a very small amount, so it's all's good.
To me, it's just, if every country is having high inflation now, that doesn't mean the U.S. had an overshoot with its aid policies. That's how I think about it. If the U.S. let's try to actually, it's a nice question. Let me try to play out. Suppose that alternatively that we find that inflation persists much longer in the U.S. than it does in countries that had a less aggressive response. That's the type of thing that would lead me to potentially change my mind about this. I mean, I think you need to connect some more dots. Basically, if every other country gets it with that has a less aggressive safety net response, in part because they have better state capacity, is able to control inflation more quickly than the U.S., that's the type of thing that would lead me to change my mind about this. But right now, it just doesn't seem like there's a strong case for that. That's I guess my high-level cross-country response.
So when you were showing the graph of the savings increases from the stimulus checks, you were kind of saying that there are some people who view that as a very positive thing and some people who view that as a very negative thing. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to both the positive and negative aspects of that, and also like more generally, like where this savings is going during a crisis. Like, is this savings that's going into banks that can then like loan it out to for like investment spending, or is this kind of savings that people are just kind of sitting on it and it's not circulating through the economy?
Great question. Is it possible to reproject, or is it totally no worries if it's not? But I figured. I just tried to pull up the plot for Jaden's question. We'll see if it comes up. So that's a really nice question. So for I'm sure I don't know exactly for where did savings go. Anil will have a better answer to that than me, so I'm gonna defer on that part. For the question of is this good or bad, or sorry, really that's the wrong words. In what ways is this good, and in what ways is this bad is more or concerning. Let me try to lay out the positive case, and then I'll try to lay out some of the concerns. So one way of expressing the concerns is that about pre-pandemic, I guess I would love to see, I imagine this question has been asked during the pandemic again, but I haven't seen it. There's a question that the Federal Reserve loves to ask now, which is, what would you do if you had a $400 financial emergency? And in particular, would you have enough money in your bank account or that you could pay bank account or easily accessible assets that you could cover a $400 emergency? And basically about 60% of households in the US say yes, I could cover it. About 40% of households say no, I would have to do something differently. Now, do something differently could be put it on the credit card. It could be borrow money from a friend. About 10% say I couldn't pay it at all. But so there's a real concern both for the 30% who would have to do something like putting debt on a credit card, and for the 10% who say they couldn't cover it at all, that they don't have enough financial reserve. And the type of fear here that's described is that something small can end up snowballing into something really big. I think this is an open area in terms of research, and I think it's going to differ a lot in terms of person. So I can't give a decisive answer about how big of a risk is the snowball issue, but people say it's there. There's some evidence that it's there. And so if savings goes up a lot, that's good because there are fewer people who are at risk of being thrown off by a small expense. The second piece, which has a labor market and public health component, is thinking about going back to work. The more savings you have in your bank account, the less you have to take a shitty job. That's positive if you're concerned about health risk and if you don't want to take a shitty job. The flip side is, and this is sort of the negative, there's two potentially negative perspectives. One question you asked is, well, what happens to the money? And you'll have a better answer to that, but one partial thing I guess I can say is that if all the low-income households in the US have their savings go up a bit, the aggregate stock of savings in the US doesn't change that much. And so it's not going to change that much how much capital there is in their economy, but it will have an impact on the lives of the households who have higher assets. And so there's a view which is totally there's no evidence other than correlating plots over time with eyeballs, but could well be true. And again, hoping to work on this in the coming year, that higher savings is leading households to be choosier and is part of the reason for why there are missing workers and why there's so many job openings without as many workers coming back into the labor force. And so if you're an employer and you see that, you are concerned because you would like to hire workers. And also, the only other thing employers can do is raise wages, but there's a concern if we have a sort of race of raising wages and prices altogether that we'll end up with a lot of inflation. So I think the downside risks are around firms not being able to hire, and firms not being able to hire in turn sparking inflation. I think the upsides are people being able to be choosier about jobs, choosier in terms of health risk, and more resilient in terms of financial emergencies. I don't know, I hope that covers the pros and cons in some sense.
Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Hamilton Avila. My daughter is a member here, and I come out once or twice a year and visit, and so I enjoy coming. The question, it's not really a question, but I'm going to invite you to comment on something that you commented briefly at an earlier question, but not really a whole lot during the presentation. And your presentation wasn't really structured to address this issue, so I'm not blaming you for not addressing this. I work for a firm that does consulting in the food industry, and every week I go to a different food manufacturer across the United States. A large percentage of them in the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard. And just from an anecdotal standpoint, I just want to comment that early on in the pandemic in 2020 and into early 2021, it seems like most of the focus of talk about government policy and how to address the pandemic focused on the ability of the individual or the impact of the pandemic on the individual person or individual household. And it seems to me that this whole thing about the supply chain was we kind of got blindsided by that from all sorts of different perspectives, with the private companies hoarding, for example, infrastructure that's required to transport goods as a result of the pandemic, to countries like China that are at the bottom of the supply chain having a more sensitive response to the pandemic, zero virus approach, that type of thing, and therefore causing choking higher up in the supply chain. But just wanted to give you an opportunity to comment about a little bit more about supply chain from the 50,000 foot level as much as you can.
I really don't know much about this. I'm sorry. I'd love to learn more.
I mean, the graph you mentioned, if you ask the typical macroeconomist, they make a graph like Peter was describing where you show what fraction of spending was on services and what's on goods. And that chart's just stunning. It's unprecedented to see so much spending shift in such an abrupt way and for such a sustained period. And so the world wasn't set up to handle this. There was a pretty vicious debate back in February when the first Biden bill was being passed. Larry Summers, who very prominent economist who worked for Obama, has worked for most of the Democratic administrations for the last 25 years, basically enraged everybody in the White House because he said, you've miscalibrated the amount of money you're pouring in. There's just no way to produce as much as you're calibrating for. And the people in the administration kind of doubled down and said, we're not going to make the mistake that you made when you were advising Obama in 2008 doing too little. And I think Summers has stomped Team Transitory. I mean, he was right. So I mean, I think people could have seen some of this stuff. I mean, the basic calculation that Larry did was very, very simple. He just tried to figure out, how much can the economy actually produce and how much you're giving out, and you're going to try to spur more production than the economy is going to be able to sustain. The other thing Peter didn't mention is the one thing that is common across all the economies in the world is central banks everywhere have insanely loose monetary policies. So the other question about inflation is how much blame do you put on the Fed? I'd say they're the first line of defense against inflation, and they basically said, "Don't worry, be happy. This isn't going to blow up on us." And now they're pivoting, so we'll see how fast that goes. There's a bunch of questions from online. I'll give you two of them and hope that we're going to run out of time. But do you want to say anything more about the missing workers and what you think the lesson will be on that for future policies? And then secondly, you've tried to stay away from health stuff, but what do you think about the relationship between work and the probability of having health insurance and the role that that might have played in whether or not people go back to work or not? If you're quick, I've got 4 more questions.
Do you want to do all of them? All right.
No,
I can-
just
okay.
go ahead.
Sure. So, well, I'm going to have very little to say. So, for missing workers, there's one idea that I wanted to mention in passing that I didn't, but I think is potentially quite important. And again, we're totally at the edge now of like speculation about different forces that are at work without much evidence. So the U.S. almost exclusively did expansion of unemployment benefits. That was the primary tool that we used for protecting the labor market. And I mentioned briefly that European countries did more payroll stabilization and payments to employers. And I generally have the view that not only could the U.S. target this poorly, but why would we ever want to pay employers when we could pay workers directly who are losing income? That's sort of my general starting point. One interesting point that I won't name the person just because I don't know whether or not they want their views to be publicly attributed at this point, but someone who studies this issue a lot made the following argument to me, which is that the payroll stabilization is a much better way to push a pause button than unemployment insurance benefits does, because you keep getting paid by your employer even while you're home, and then the employer who is paying you all along says, okay, we've pushed unpause, come back. And so European countries, like France in particular was the one they named, have employment rates now that are higher than they were pre-pandemic. And the argument was that payroll stabilization was a better way to push pause and unpause than UI benefits. And so I think that's one interesting dimension that I hope we'll learn more about, is how was payroll stabilization better at pushing pause than unemployment benefits would have been. Beyond that, I don't know, you can read all the theories in the newspaper for missing workers. I don't, beyond that one point about the sort of trade-off between paying employers and employees, I don't think we know a lot yet. And I think we'll know more in a year, and we'll feel, Rick, I think, where's Rick sitting? There. I think we'll know a lot more in a year whether the way that the US did it led to a bunch of wage increases for low-income workers, which is something I would view as desirable, or did we screw, but ended us up at the same place but with more wage increases for low-income workers, or did we bungle things up in a meaningful way? And I think about a year we'll probably know more about that. Having health insurance, clearly it's a situation with a lot of health risk, and so introspection might suggest that having health insurance is even more important. But I don't really understand the argument in terms of the economics of it, because all the COVID activities are basically free. Like the government's covering the financial costs associated with getting care for COVID, even for workers who aren't insured. And so I don't see how the economic argument around that holds up. I mean, you could say, well, people don't know that the government's covering the costs. You can make more elaborate arguments, but the sort of the financial value of health insurance for dealing specifically with COVID seems very limited because the government has a direct policy there.
Alan will have the last question.
Alan McGee here. The last numbers on inflation, I sort of said, yikes. I also know that bad inflation can be very, very bad. My personal perspective is fixed income. So what should I be doing to protect myself, be careful, not get hurt with inflation, etc.?
That's a great question. It's not one that I have given a lot of thought to. I think the answer depends in part on how much is fixed income that's tied to inflation versus fixed income that's not. So I'm going to use a specific example of a Social Security check. So Social Security is tied to inflation. And so to the extent that prices as a whole rise, there'll be a cost of living increase each year associated with that. I think for fixed income that's tied explicitly to inflation, I would basically not be worried, precisely because it's tied to inflation. Could be someone else who's, I don't know, watching on the live stream, who say has an annuity it's not tied to inflation. Most annuities are not tied to inflation. And in that type of situation, I think you basically want to try to take steps to have money in places that are relatively more tied to inflation. So like the stock market or housing wealth will be more able to keep up with inflation than cash will. Now, even that, if interest rates rise, then you'll also be okay, but it'll take a little while for that to happen. And so there's definitely more risk for fixed income that's not associated with inflation.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great. He was very modest about not telling you how much of what we know about what's happened during COVID is due to the work of him and his co-authors. There's quite a bit of what we've learned is actually direct research that Peter's done in combination with the people at JP Morgan. They've got an amazing data set that they've used in lots of clever ways. So anyway, thanks for sharing. I'm going to close with a quote from a 19th century politician named William Gilmore Simms. And he said, "I believe economists put decimal points on their forecasts to show that they have a sense of humor." So thank you, and we'll see you back here in the new year.